Hello, I'm David Redwine, and I'd like to talk with you about the origin of endometriosis, specifically Opitz's embryonic mesoblast theory of origin and other GYN pathologies. All early theories of origin of endometriosis were embryonic. In 1882, Babs found endometriosis within a fibroid and wondered whether it might be due to an embryonic rest of endometriosis. In 1886, von Recklinghausen commented on the patterns that he observed where deep endometriosis was found in areas of muscular tissue, such as round ligament, bowel, bladder, uterus, and so on. In 1900, Opitz theorized that during embryogenesis, Mullerian mesoblastic threads grow into connective tissue of the pelvis during embryogenesis and result in endometriosis. If you recall from embryology, there are three embryonic layers. The outer layer is the ectoderm, which forms skin and central nervous system. The endoderm forms GI and GU mucosa, and the mesoderm forms everything else. Opus mesoblast, therefore, would be early developing mesoderm. And there's things even earlier than that, of course. But in 1908, Klage applied Opitz theory to deep endometriosis, and all the questions of origin were answered. And there things sat, but plausible genetic support was lacking. Meanwhile, in the 1920s, a theory of origin of endometriosis based on cartoons was advanced. In the 1930s, women's ovaries were being destroyed with radiation to treat endometriosis. In the 1940s, some surgeons were taking endometriosis out of the pelvis and doing conservative surgery, causing Joe Meggs to say that it could be cured. The 1950s brought color television sets. The 1960s brought birth control pills. The 1970s brought electrocoagulation. The 1980s brought danazol, as well as my embryonic theory of origin of endometriosis. The 1990s brought laser vaporization, which doesn't always destroy even superficial endometriosis, and also brought Lupron, which can result in long-term ovarian dysfunction in 25 to 40% of young women who take it. The 2000s brought the robot, which showed that equivalent results could be obtained more slowly and more expensively. And by the late 20 teens, Oralissa came along, which isn't really even as good as a low-dose birth control pill because it's not a low-dose birth control pill. But by the late 20s, teens, the wait is over. The genetic basis of the embryonic origin of endometriosis is being unraveled by genome-wide association studies such as this one, where elevated single nucleotide polymorphisms were found. And when you look at the function, the downstream function of these findings, embryonic development, estrogen response, angiogenesis, cell proliferation, Hox genes are thrown in there, gene silencer, basically a lot of the stuff that we know about endometriosis occurs because of a genetic load at conception. By day 12, gastrulation begins to form mesoderm. Gastrulation is where the epiblast cells are converted into mesoderm through the primitive groove. And here is a video showing that. So endometriosis is mesodermal tissue. All reported sites of occurrence are in mesoderm, and you can see them all listed there. The genetic expression of that genetic load is manifest as formation of abnormal mesoderm during embryogenesis. Here is another view of a different view of mesoderm development in the chicken embryo. The yellow is the internal organs developing. You can almost imagine that as the mesoderm forms, little bits and pieces can be scattered off and result in endometriosis later. Here's an early diagram I made in 1988 showing, in essence, somewhat the same thing. The G stands for gonads, ovary cells. The E stands for endometrium, and the U stands for uterine cells, such as the muscular layer of the uterus. As embryogenesis progresses, the gonadal cells begin to aggregate, the uterine and endometrial cells begin to aggregate. This results in embryologically patterned tissue tracts, which can contain either endometriosis, or possibly being surrounded by metaplasia-capable cells, also called stem cells, also in the distant past called totipotential, omnipotential, pluripotential cells. So looking at metaplasia-capable cells being deposited alongside endometriosis, schematically it would look something like this, with superficial endometriosis on the peritoneal surface represented by this E. But outward from that, you have a gradient of cells which may serve as stem cells. So if you come along and remove all of the endometriosis but leave some of the stem cells around the edge, you can have superficial recurrence. Whereas if you take out a wide margin with and leave no area of residual stem cells, you can have local cure. And the same thing can apply to deep endometriosis, except the gradient of area of no stem cells is probably located a little bit further out. So superficial recurrence after excision is explained by Opitz model. Endometriosis has been studied extensively, tens of thousands of articles over the decades, massive amount of detailed subcellular information, but this has been looking at pine needles rather than at the forest. Endometriosis does not exist alone. For example, endosalpingiosis is a close cousin which can sometimes cause pelvic pain, so they're somehow related. But wait, if we're going to talk about epithelial processes, endocervicosis, which is very rare, must be related somehow. And then what about adenomyosis and fibroids? They certainly have a muscular component, but adenomyosis also has a relationship to endometriosis and endometriosis to fibroids. What about the structural defects that we see with endometriosis, cervical stenosis, renal agenesis, etc.? That must be on there interconnected some way. And the occurrence in males, that must be really high up the genome. If you think of it in this way, there should be a Mulleriosis gene ensemble, which would explain all of this. And what would that look like? Well, it would be part of the human genome. And in fact, all the previous genes that I mentioned and more have already been identified and can be thrown into this gene ensemble. And then there's everything else in the human genome. So this abnormal Mullerian gene ensemble results in abnormal differentiation and migration of mesoderm during gastrulation, which leads to all of the cellular processes that we've already discussed. But it also leads to ovulation defects, endometriosis in males, and other mesothelial rests and inclusion cysts. And for each of these yellow tissue types, there is a genetically determined trait that can range from anatomic location to morphology, histologic activity, symptom severity, malignant potential, and those traits can vary from none to severe depending on the way the genetic cards were dealt. So everything is patterned in utero. The familiar patterns of frequency of involvement of the pelvis, most common in the posterior pelvis because that's the area, that's the pathway of embryogenesis of the pelvic organs, with the deeper patterns of deep endometriosis in muscular tissue, such as uterosacral ligaments. There are macro patterns of intestinal endometriosis that people are aware of. Here are the rectosigmoid colon, the most common area, the terminal ileum and appendix, and so on. And these manifestations are very familiar to those with a lot of intestinal experience. There are micro patterns of endometriosis. There are predictable patterns of pelvic and intestinal endometriosis where it can occur on the anti-mesenteric and anti-mesosalpingeal surface of the ileum and the bowel and the tube. The posterior pelvis, most common site because it's in the pathway of organogenesis. And again, von Recklinghausen's pattern in uterosacral ligaments and other muscular tissue. Another micro pattern is widespread superficial peritoneal disease. Another micro pattern, first type, is hidden seeding of the sigmoid colon, as pointed out by Horace Roman from France, finding little islands of apparently not very symptomatic and certainly not nodular endometriosis. The colonic mucosa, by the way, is endoderm, and the rest is mesoderm. And since that's why the colonic mucosa is not a primary site of endometriosis, because it's endoderm, not mesoderm. Micro pattern 2, hidden seating of the ovary, is shown by William Wood Russell, the man sitting on the stool. He found on the inside of the ovary little islands of endometriosis and postulated that it was there by some kind of embryonic process. Macro pattern 3 is hidden seating of the lymph nodes, first described by Emil Rice in 1897. These are found near to nodular intestinal endometriosis and seem to be just a more widespread scattering that can occur in more severe disease. The embryologically patterned ratios of sites of endometriosis extend out of the pelvis. For example, right diaphragm is involved 10-to-1 over the left diaphragm. Same for the right inguinal canal versus left inguinal canal. Right sciatic nerve, 2-to-1 favored over left sciatic nerve. And if you consider that these sites, these patterned sites, may extend all over the body, including to the anterior abdominal wall, and may somehow relate to the occurrence of scar endometriosis. My personal path to embryonic origin began with a publication in 1987, where I found that older age groups don't have more endometriosis. So the geographic spread predicted by Sampson's theory I could not confirm it, and so Sampson appeared to be wrong. Another publication showed that subtle disease may be missed at the first laparoscopy, but more obvious later, giving the false impression of new disease, when actually all that's happened is just a change in color. This led me to understand that since there was no photomicrograph showing initial attachment and subsequent proliferation and invasion to support Sampson's theory, that an embryonic origin had to be the favored, and that's when I published that article. And I had a proof of concept of what appeared to be infant endometriosis. I talked about pattern tracts. Because of these pattern tracts, endometriosis can be cured if all those tracts are completely removed, which I showed can be apparently done by a publication in 1991. Well, as you know now, there's all kinds of publications about fetal endometriosis. Fingertip endometriosis, mesoderm. Again, I was there in 1988 with an embryonic origin of endometriosis exclusively, because an embryonic origin such as postulated by Opitz really explains all that we know about the disease. Shashruta wrote that surgery has the advantage of producing instantaneous effects, so it's the highest of all medical tantras. And Hippocrates, the father of deep endometriosis, wrote that the diseases which medicines cannot cure, excision cures. Again, Joe Meggs, as far back as 1953, said that recurrence is not frequent and cure by conservative surgery is usual. And the cure rates, where but no disease was found at reoperation, are interesting. 66% cured by laparotomy excision, and between 57 and 100% cured by laparoscopy excision, with disease reduction in most of those who had any. So endometriosis is not a random disease. It follows genetically dictated patterns. If you remove the patterns, there's the potential to cure the disease. What we're seeing is convergence on the embryonic, therefore genetic origin of endometriosis. And it's interesting that different authors have arrived at an embryonic conclusion from different directions and actually during different centuries. Genetic control of embryogenesis is being investigated, and parts of all previous embryonic theories will be confirmed. And here are some of the embryonic theorists from the past. Opitz in 1900, myself in 1988. I think this makes me the earliest adopter of an exclusive embryonic origin of endometriosis among living physicians. So what we're seeing with Sampson's theory is we're seeing divergence, reflux menstruation, it's increasingly large, unreconciled differences which just can't be explained. And supporters resort to cartoons and fantasy and even fabrication of evidence for proof. So Sampson's theory, reflux menstruation predicts failures of all therapy because it'll just come back. This creates an unholy symbiosis with medical therapy and incomplete surgery, which provide the failure that's predicted by the theory, thus a circular proof of the theory and of incurability of endometriosis. Given the number of women in the world that have been affected by treatments based on this theory, and the fact that this theory still is struggling for scientific proof after about 100 years of easily trying, it becomes the most dangerous theory in the history of medicine ever. We don't need reflux menstruation anymore. Opitz explained it all. When you think some medical fact is new, just read the old German literature. Opitz was right and Samson was wrong. So thank you very much.